In this current moment of stark polarization, swaggering incivility, and self-congratulatory fury, do the left and the right agree on anything? Yes, as it happens, they agree that our politics has become a seemingly endless shoving match in the backseat of America's careening station wagon. Our next guest used those words to start a recent column for National Review Online. John Hood is chairman of the John Locke Foundation. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Mitch.
So, the left and the right agree. We've got a big problem with this polarization and all of the rancor in our politics. What do we do with that information?
Well, it's an important piece of agreement, and it's not obvious necessarily because some people argue, and I have argued in the past, we ought not to romanticize America's political history as if we have disagreements today and they go to the heart of the matter and there's all this partisan polarization, and that's different from the way it used to be back in the good old days. I don't think we want to fall for that trap because we know that the presidential election of 1800 was vicious, that the era of good feelings that happened in the early 19th century was not an era of good feelings. There was a lot of hatred.
A vice president killed a rival in a duel.
So we don't want to exaggerate. On the other hand, at least in the recent past, to the extent that we have polling that goes back several decades, it is simply the case that both Democratic-leaning voters and Republican-leaning voters appear to be dissatisfied with the political conversation in a way that they were not previously. So when Bill Clinton was president, the Democrat, in the 90s, Republicans were upset often about what he did until the Congress went Republican and then the Democrats got mad and so forth. Then similarly, George W. Bush, during his 8 years in the presidency, Democrats went unhinged. So it's not the case that I'm arguing there's something surprising about the party out of power being angry, being mobilized against whoever the White House party is. What I'm getting at is that both parties today are upset. I cite in the polling data that in Gallup polling and in some other polling, Americans have a declining sense that their government is working. And obviously Democrats are more likely to say that right now because they are not the party in the White House. They're not the party in charge of Capitol Hill. They're not the party in charge of most states, including North Carolina, at least not fully. So that's not surprising. What's surprising is that Republicans are at best split on the issue of is government working really well, is American government succeeding. That was not true as recently as the George W. Bush years, when the Democrats would say, we're not sure government's working. And the Republicans, 80% of Republicans would say, sure, the government's working fine. That's not where we are today. Now, this is not the same thing as saying Republicans are not approving of Donald Trump as president. The vast majority of Republicans approve of the Republican president. That has been true for Democrats when they're Democratic presidents. But when you ask them not so much about personalities, but about what's the political situation like? What's the political talk like? How do you get along with people who disagree with you politically? The numbers there are pretty damning, and they do in fact cross party divides. So if we have an agreement that there's something wrong, immediate question is, well, what is it? If we all agree the car is sputtering and we put it in drive and it only sometimes goes forward, and so we kind of nurse it to the mechanic's shop. We all in agreement we need to be at the mechanic's shop. But the next problem comes when you lift the hood. And one mechanic says, well, your problem's right over there. The other mechanic says, no, it's way over here. That's where our disagreements still exist. Republicans say, well, of course there's a political polarization problem. There's a lack of civility. It's because of those Democrats, the people in the minority in Congress, the left-wing media, campuses, they're all left-wing. They're turning out generations after generations of crazy people, and they're arguing back and forth. And, of course, the Democrats have their own version of those causes that involve the Koch brothers or Fox News or Donald Trump himself, though that one doesn't quite work since this concern predates Donald Trump. He may be part of the story, but he can't be the causal factor of a story that people were writing about in 2014 when Donald Trump was, but that time he might have still been a Democrat. I'm not sure. So what do we do about this is kind of the big challenge, Mitch. And I think that one version of the what do we do about this is part of the problem. So a liberal or a conservative will write a story about this or make a speech about this. And when you get to the end, what they really want is the other side to capitulate. We would stop having all these polarized, uncivil arguments if you would just convert to my side. Well,
that would make things easy.
Absolutely. However, I don't think that's a realistic prospect. So if that's not the answer, and we're not going to convert each other necessarily, then how do we get along better? In my view, this involves developing a real understanding not only of our own position, but of the position of people who are opposed to us. And really imagine that you could believe that. If you had a different set of facts than the one that you believe to be true, if you had thought about it in a different way, if you had different preferences, could you come to this radically different conclusion than the one you hold? If you cannot even imagine why you would ever think that, then we're going to have a difficulty really having a conversation. But if you could imagine that, it's sort of a leap of imagination. If you can do that, you can have a more productive conversation. And at the North Carolina Leadership Forum, which is the project that I helped to start it's based at Duke University, but it's a statewide program that brings leaders together. That's exactly what we try to do. We're not trying to convert everybody to my point of view, though, of course, that would be wise, since I'm always right. What we're trying to do instead is to get people to imagine, to learn from each other, imagine what it would be like to have a different point of view, and we think that's going to improve the debate. It's not going to end the debate. Debate's great. Debate's part of what a free society ought to be doing. But we need to learn to argue with each other, not bicker with each other, and we're making the distinction between the two.
One of the points that you make after discussing the North Carolina Leadership Forum is that leadership matters.
It certainly does. We could throw up our hands and say, well, if everybody's polarized and everybody's mad at each other, there's nothing we can do about it, because it's not really the politicians who are doing it, it's the people. And the politicians are simply catering to what the people want. They're just trying to get reelected, so they might otherwise act in a grown-up fashion, but it's really we the people who are the problem. There might be some truth to that, but it doesn't really lead anywhere. And so we believe that a contrary theory has at least as much power, at least as much empirical data to support it, which is people follow their leaders. If leaders behave in an elevated way, if they conduct themselves like grown-ups, then people tend to follow that and be at least a bit grown up. If the leaders act like adolescents, then it will dumb down or age down all the rest of us, because we follow our leaders just like everybody else does. So we're focusing at the North Carolina Leadership Forum on improving the conduct of political disagreement among leaders, because we think that if this is done, very publicly done, and it's very obvious that people are conducting themselves in a more healthy manner, we think that the voters, everybody else, will tend to follow the lead.
In the brief time we have left, do you see any signs that this is having any benefits so far?
We've only been a couple of years into this process at the North Carolina Leadership Forum. We think there is some sign of progress. The participants themselves say that's changing the way they behave. And we're starting to see people from the left and people from the right who disagree on a few things or many things come together on something else and say, hey, even though we disagree about lots of things, here's something we agree on, and let's talk about that a little bit. We're seeing those kinds of phenomena like in criminal justice reform, where there has been a sort of a left-right convergence on some matters. And again, I'm not arguing that we need to moderate everything. I'm a conservative. I've got strong opinions. But when there are opportunities to compare notes and actually see some commonalities, I think we ought to do it.